Hello, happy Thursday from Studio Room 2C, where there's always room to see how countries compare. I'm Andrew Canane. Welcome back to your AP Comparative Government prep lessons right here on YouTube, brought to you by College Board. We are making our way through that content from units 1, 2, and 3 that we know are going to be fair game on your AP Comparative Government test on May 22nd. Today, we are looking at topic 3.7. We are exploring how authoritarian governments and democratic governments treat civil liberties and civil rights. And tomorrow is going to be our last content day in Unit 3. And then I'm going back to some unit reviews. And always, always, always a focus on writing and test prep as we get ready for your FRQ writing to polish your skills and how to integrate the content. So let's not hesitate. Again, I'm Andrew Canane from the suburbs of Chicago. I teach AP Comparative Government. I also teach AP US Government at Adlai E. Stevenson High School. I'm going to take you into the internet here in a moment because I want you to see the course description. You know that if you've watched these programs, you can go to the direct link there. You can also go to our website, citizenu.org, that Mr. Larson created. Go to Comparative Corner. Browse through Mr. Review's materials and our videos for AP US Government. Go to Comparative Corner if you want to see my supplemental notes that I use on the slides for these presentations. But I want to take you to the course description because I want to show you. I got a great question through social media. Let's see, I'm gonna figure out how to do this. Let's go to Chrome. There we go. And when you go to, again, that course description, this is put together by College Board. Someone reached out to me and asked, do you have a study guide? Do you recommend a study guide out there? And there's a lot of different study guides, grids, and charts that you can put together for units 1, 2, and 3, that you can put together for country-specific material. But really, I really suggest you use the course description as a study guide because there's some really good notes. All the concepts that are fair game from units 1, 2, and 3 are in there. And I want you to see today's particular topic, 3.7, an example of how you could use this as a study guide. So we're making our way through unit 2. Let's see. And here's unit 3. So when you go to civil liberties and civil rights, when you download that course description, and this is fair game, this is, your teachers have access to this and you have access to this. When you go to 3.7, civil rights and civil liberties, you're going to see anything in the essential knowledge. Essentially, this is fair game content. And if there were multiple choice questions, which there are not on this revised 2020 AP comparative exam. But if there were multiple choice questions, you could go through this content and you can see, well, these are fair game content answers on a multiple choice. And this is, some fair game expectation for content, specific country content that AP comparative government's students should know. And so you're going to see, I'm giving you a preview of civil rights and civil liberties here, and how specific it gets with Iranian courts and their treatment of media owners, Russian government nationalization of media broadcast. But I want to give you a preview of today's FRQ. And I'll mention this a couple different times when I'm talking about the FRQ, because I'm going to do one more example of an argument essay, and then I'm going to try to find an example of quantitative analysis. I can't promise you that, but that is my goal, is that tomorrow when we wrap up unit 3, we'll go to that very important quantitative analysis. But this is going to be our last unit 3 argument essay that we've done the last few lessons. But I want you to see where I get the language from this argument essay. I'm pulling it straight from the course description. And so this is a way you can read the course description, read it critically, read it detail. It's units 1, 2, and 3 of the fair game units. So go through those essential knowledge and you can see country-specific examples that you can absolutely use those examples in different essay writing you're doing for both the argument essay and the quantitative analysis. You know, you're not going to cut and paste this. You want to use your own words, but this is what you should know. And so use this course description and understand it. That's a really, and use it as a review guide. But I wanted to show you this language. So civil liberties over time can determine, comparing data that shows the extent to which governments protect or restrict civil liberties over time can determine placement on an authoritarian democratic scale. You're going to see that language. I bring it into the argument essay. I'm not making it up. I'm not pulling it out of thin air. I'm pulling it in from the course description because I think it could really lead to a really good argument essay, and particularly a good argument essay for you to practice understanding content and how to tie that content in to really good argumentation writing. So I'm going to go back to my presentation, but so use that course description as a study guide. It can be super, super helpful in your preparations. Again, the exam is May 22nd. All other details about the exam, including more specific descriptions of the FRQs, are at AP Coronavirus Updates. And I want to thank our social media shout outs. Mr. Kokenga with a great shout out about Ai Weiwei and some of Ai Weiwei's takes about coronavirus and China's government's response to coronavirus. And if you know Ai Weiwei, famous, really world famous artist in China, notoriously confronts the authoritarian style of China's government and has some current events out there sharing Ai Weiwei's thoughts about China's government's response to coronavirus. And Elena's examples, we were yesterday exploring political participation, particularly that concept of informal participation or protests, or even just YouTube videos or viral videos. And several years ago, a group of Iranian students got together. They did, when Pharrell Williams' Happy was popular around the world, they created essentially their own music video, just young adults in Iran having fun. It went viral. The government found them, tracked them down, and sentenced them to some pretty harsh punishments. Those punishments weren't necessarily carried out because of the international attention that case got, but the courts definitely came down with the sentencing of tough punishments just for videos or images that seem to go against, according to the religious judges, seem to go against the tenets of Shia Islam. And the government's and the court's responsibility, according to the Constitution, to uphold the principles of Shia Islam. So I want to thank Elena for that example at #APCompGov. And students keep on sharing great ideas about essay writing and questions. So don't hesitate to give your teacher a shout out, give those classmates you're missing a shout out. Or if you have questions, if you want feedback on some short writing samples, I'll try to find time for that. So here's a preview, as I was showing you earlier on the course description. Here's a preview of the argument essay that we are going to go over by the end of today's lesson, 3.7. And I'm kind of sticking with this more open-ended way to phrase an argument essay. If you watched earlier lessons where I did argument essay, I essentially narrowed it down to you choosing this or that as an effective means, or yes or no, is this effective? And you had to connect that to a concept. I kind of like this style more. I don't predict questions. I certainly don't predict questions. But I like the idea that an argument essay is going to give you a chance to kind of have a broad overview, to maybe not just say yes or no and here's why, but give you a broader take. So assess how a regime can be placed on an authoritarian democratic scale based on the protection of civil liberties. And literally that comes straight from the course description, but you can turn that into an argument essay. You could turn it into a quantitative analysis as well. I'm going to show you data later from Freedom House that you can definitely turn that into a quantitative analysis. But today I've turned it into an argument essay, and I'm asking you to connect it, hopefully a term we looked at the very beginning of Unit 1 and Unit 3. a term that hopefully you've mastered, and that is civil society. So I'll show you that full question as we wrap up lesson 3.7, looking at civil liberties and civil rights, comparing the treatment of civil liberties and civil rights in all 6 course countries, with a particular focus on trying to connect back to that topic from Unit 1, 1.3, where we are looking at the difference between democracy and authoritarian regimes. Again, we're making our way through. We have one more content lesson on Unit 3, and then I'm going through each of the units in kind of a review video before we go into 5 days of test prep. And what you need to know today, gosh, I have to update those. Let's go. I know we're the critical vocabulary. I forgot to update that slide. Showing you the whole thing. There we go. So you should know civil liberties. You should know political rights. You should know civil rights. You should know this word coercion. And I'm going back to that word we were looking at yesterday as well, informal political participation. Because a lot of times this is protest, or like I mentioned before, Elena's example on Twitter, that viral video that those Iranian students posted wasn't necessarily even a political commentary. It was certainly interpreted by Iran's government as political commentary. It was just kind of a typical video that was popular around the world at that time, but happened to be that video was interpreted as political speech in Iran and was punished, again, because that informal political participation was seen by legal authorities in Iran as subverting the religious principles that Iran's government was supposed to uphold, and certainly use of coercion, the tough sentence, very harsh sentence that came out of that case. And we'll talk about civil liberties, we'll contrast that with civil rights, and really focused also on political rights when it comes to candidates running for office. So I'm going to go back. Sorry, I messed that up. And giving you a whole preview of this whole lesson. And so when we talk about civil liberties, you should know how civil liberties are treated across the 6 different course countries. And I try to tell my students, and I also teach AP US government, where it's very common where you have to distinguish between civil liberties and civil rights, because civil rights is a big part of actually Unit 3 in AP US government as well. And civil liberties is that protection of individual rights. It could be the right to free speech, the right to assemble, and those protections from an abuse of government. And what's pretty interesting, in all 5 of our countries that have constitutional rights, and we'll also include the United Kingdom because there are certainly some laws that speak to the right to free assembly, and also some speech rights that are written down in constitutions or legal provisions in all 6 countries, that it's really common in both democratic governments and authoritarian governments, that governments, it's very common, have a written protection of civil liberties, particularly that right to assemble and the right to free speech. And yet we know that in more authoritarian governments, particularly China, Iran, and very much to an extent in Russia, the protection of those civil liberties is really weak. And if there's any protection of those civil liberties at all, when it comes to assembly or speech that is interpreted to be against the government, or criticizing the government, or criticizing the central rulers of the government. And so it's one thing, we've talked a lot about rule of law. Rule of law is where the law matters. We have a written, in a more democratic regime, you have a written protection of civil liberties, and that government consistently upholds those civil liberties more often than it violates those civil liberties. And certainly we know that in any authoritarian or democracy, there's certainly security protections that any government is going to take to prevent chaos on the streets. But we know that democracies are more likely to uphold civil liberties, even if that means that free speech, or if that free assembly is criticizing the government. But that is not the case in China, Iran. I mentioned that example earlier that Elena put out on Twitter of those students and that informal participation that was punished. And China also comes down very harshly on any protest, whether it be a formal protest, a tried to coordinate, or more likely an informal protest that's coordinated in secret, that protests that challenge the underlying rule of the Communist Party. If the government of China interprets that speech to be critical of the rule of the Chinese Communist Party or the rule of those top leaders of the Communist Party, that speech is going to be harshly punished. And oftentimes, sometimes public trials that can last very short, a lot of pressure on the people who participate in those speeches to publicly confess to treason or speech that is trying to undermine the government. The government in China, very authoritarian when it comes to not protecting civil liberties that are deemed to be undercutting or critical of the Communist Party's rule. Russia, we're going to see, in fact, in this topic 3.7, there's a definition of Russia, what we call illiberal democracy. And you'll see that content note here in a moment. But remember, Russia does allow some groups to protest policy. There are some groups that protest Putin or policies from the central government. But it's also pretty common that the government will come in and try to restrict those protests, what might be local security officials that are trying to prevent. They're using local rules to try to prevent that protest from taking place, or coordinating counter protests, or using this law that was passed in 2012 to criminalize some of these protests. But you still see some of those protests take place. You know, not everyone who takes part in those protests is arrested. And so that would be Russia's treatment, where you kind of see, yes, more authoritarian tactics to try to shut down those protests, but in some cases they do happen. A good example is that Russia does allow the formation of non-governmental organizations. So there are some civil society groups, NGOs, that form, but we also know that after those big protests of 2011 and 2012, Russia passed laws that made it more difficult for those NGOs to form and sustain, because those groups had to register as foreign agents if they received any outside funding from international sources. And so those groups were tarnished. The image of those groups was tarnished. That if you were a Russian citizen who belonged to one of those NGOs that got some funding from international sources, you were then labeled as a foreign agent. And so that was one of the ways that Russia tried to prevent or diminish the role of these civil society groups. We know that Nigeria has protections on the right to free assembly and the right to free speech. We've actually seen attempts by Nigeria's government to actually pass legislation in 2018 that would have monitored groups, NGOs, kind of similar to what Russia did with their 2012 law, where they monitored groups and used technology to monitor those groups. Nigeria was trying to pass a somewhat similar idea of restrictions on NGOs, but it was actually NGOs and pressure groups that they're sometimes called in Nigeria that pushed back against that legislation, and it was never passed. But that was as recently as 2018. You've also seen, a really big prominent NGO, Amnesty International, criticize Nigeria's military because of this perception or reports, and in some cases factual reporting, that the military was not doing enough to prevent Boko Haram attacks on different religious groups in Nigeria. This international NGO, Amnesty International, criticized Nigeria's military, and military leaders in Nigeria threatened to shut Amnesty International down. So that's where you see some authoritarian tactics, even though Nigeria protects the right to free speech, protects the right to assembly. You have seen some authoritarian tactics in Nigeria. Another example, I mentioned this yesterday, is that there are plenty of stories out there of Nigeria's security forces who use violence, firearms to suppress speech that is critical of the government, and using this excessive violence. And certainly you can't ignore those stories of that in Nigeria. When it comes to civil liberties, another aspect of civil liberties is your right to access information. It's not just the right to free speech, but it's also how do I get information? So we know that democracies try to tend towards governmental transparency, even when that governmental transparency might lead to criticism of government actions or, being shown to be hypocritical or leads to the revealing of governmental scandals. Democracies tend towards governmental transparency. The best example of governmental transparency in democratic governments are what we call Freedom of Information Acts. We have this in the United States. A lot of state and local governments have Freedom of Information Acts, where bodies of government are supposed to have open meetings, reveal contracts, reveal government decisions. And those Freedom of Information Acts are supposed to work the same in countries that have enacted these, including United Kingdom, Nigeria, and Mexico. All three of those countries, interestingly, within the last 20 years, have passed Freedom of Information Acts to make this government information more accessible. We know that in countries that have more of a democratic tradition, like the United Kingdom, they tend to comply with those FOIA or Freedom of Information Acts more consistently. But we've also seen political scientists and journalist groups report that, this should say, where's that copy editor today? So Mexico passed its Freedom of Information Act in 2002. Nigeria passed its in 2011. And both have examples where the governments have released information under these laws, but some inconsistency in two countries that have been democratizing and trying to, in some cases, trying to strengthen democracy when it comes to the release of information. But still some notable inconsistencies when you read some current events about Mexico and Nigeria and the FOIA in those two countries. Now, when you come to Iran, Russia, China, there's no expectation that the government's going to provide information, particularly to independent journalists. There is no guarantee that's going to happen. And it's all the more common that the government won't hand over information to independent journalists unless that information is meant to uphold some kind of government goal. So for instance, if a government official in China who might be a rival to President Xi Jinping is suspected of corruption, that's the case where China's government would hand over information to state media, journalists connected to state media, as a way to tarnish that political figure or that business person's reputation if there's actually an end result that's going to uphold the government. That's when information tends to be handed over. So I was mentioning before, in the course description, those asterisks are information that's sourced directly from the course description. So here's where we have some really good examples in the course description I was showing you earlier about authoritarian governments monitoring and restricting citizens' media access. So this is where we see a reference to the Great Firewall in China and the Chinese Communist Party's use of the Great Firewall to monitor and limit political criticism on social media and to censor any information, including searches of the use of violence to suppress the speech in 1989's Tiananmen Square student movement. You can't get that information inside China on the internet because of the Great Firewall. The course description points to examples in Iran where media licenses, when you have had cases of independent newspapers, those media licenses have been revoked in some cases when a court finds that the owners of those newspapers or those internet sites publish anti-religious material. So that's an example of an authoritarian government kind of cracking down on the right to free speech that's mentioned in the course description. And of course, I've mentioned in a previous lesson that Russia had a glimmer of independent media right before Putin became president. When the first president, Boris Yeltsin, was president, there was some independent broadcast media. But one of the first moves that the Putin administration made 20 years ago was to force that independent owner of a broadcast out of the country with accusations of corruption. The Russian government took over that broadcast outlet, Channel 1, And so that was an example of nationalizing broadcast media. And Russia's government, like a more authoritarian government, they control the big broadcasts, whether it be TV or radio. And this is another distinguishing between authoritarian regimes and democratic regimes. We know that in more democratic regimes, and the government that's deemed to be the most democratic of the countries we look at in AP Comparative, they have government ownership of the media. There is a relationship between the government and particularly broadcast media, whether it comes to the licensing of television stations or radio stations to broadcast over airwaves. That's a relationship between the media and the government. And we know that, for example, BBC in the United Kingdom, there is a financial relationship between the British government and BBC to some degree. But we know that democratic regimes are more likely to allow a wider range of information to be broadcast, particularly news or speech that is critical of the government's performance, critical of the government's policies. And that's one of the ways you can measure a democracy, is how much criticism is allowed, particularly in broadcast media, where we know the government does have regulations and controls, but how much restriction is there of the government to try to restrict access to critical news in broadcast media specifically. So China, Iran, and Russia, more authoritarian on the spectrum on that scale. And we know that the broadcast outlets in all three of those countries are particularly careful to not let news come out that is critical of those in charge, of the parties in charge or the factions in charge. And sometimes this veers, particularly in Russia, where you do have private ownership of broadcast media, but there's also this idea that if you privately own a TV station or a radio station in Russia, you better self-censor and prevent the broadcast of news that's critical to the government. Otherwise, the Russian government comes in and shuts down the outlet, maybe strips ownership of those private owners. So it's a way of encouraging what's self-censorship, which is another authoritarian means that you see in governments like Russia. So that is how we can distinguish authoritarian and democratic governments when it comes to treatment of media. But then we also have this note of civil liberty protections and governmental transparency. We have this note that I was mentioning earlier of comparing data to show the extent to which governments protect or restrict civil liberties over time. And there's no data that's used more often in AP comparative class than Freedom House, which is an American entity and actually gets some of its funding from the US State Department, which leads us into some questions on, what are the biases of this? And those are fair to talk about. But this is data that's commonly used by political scientists to assess the degree of freedoms or the degree of restrictions that we see in countries all over the world. Every year there's a publishing of what the scores are. I showed you yesterday the Freedom on the Net scores. And there's all kinds of metrics that Freedom House uses and updates. And today, I think I've shown you this data in a previous lesson. These are the Freedom House scores according to 2019 on political rights, the right for candidates, the right to have competitive elections, the right to have candidates who are opposed to the government running for office, versus the treatment of civil liberties such as access to media, access to the internet, the right to free speech, the right to criticize and assemble independently. And so you can see this data, and I've listed the countries alphabetically, but you can see that in AP comparative, China, Iran score the lowest. If 100 is the most free, the United Kingdom scores a 94 based on its scores for political rights and civil liberties. China, Iran get the lowest scores and are deemed to be not free. And Russia scores a 20, so slightly above Iran. It's also deemed to be not free by Freedom House, which is always interesting to me, because in AP comparative government, we still see this note here that Russia is what's sometimes called a competitive authoritarian regime. It acts as a hybrid of democratic and authoritarian regimes. And so this is where we get three words: illiberal democracy, competitive authoritarian regime, hybrid regime. And those are all meant in the course description to talk about Russia because Russia has this history of elections. They hold regularly scheduled elections. We know that there are some people who are elected into the Duma. So this is unlike Iran and the Majlis, where moderates are now filtered out. We know that there are some people who are elected into the national legislature who speak out against Putin, who speak out against United Russia. That's much more likely to happen in Russia. But we also know that elections aren't competitive. It's not, Putin's not going to lose an election. United Russia is not going to lose the majority anytime soon. We know that Russia has promises of protections of the right to assembly, the right to free speech, that they allow for independent civil society groups to form, but we also know that those civil liberties are really protected inconsistently, that Russian government tends to veer towards trying to shut down or prevent speech that is critical of the government. So that's where the course description has this definition of illiberal democracy. There are some elements that look democratic in Russia. Again, if you're an opponent to Putin, it's more likely that you're going to be able to be elected into the Duma than into the national legislature of Iran. But certainly when you look at the data from Freedom House claims that Russia is just flat out not free. So that's the interesting part about looking at, different takes on the governments in AP comparative government. So if you have examples of authoritarian control of broadcast media, feel free to share those out. There's sometimes some really interesting stories that you can get from state media and what state media reveals about, for instance, what China's state media was reporting about coronavirus compared to what international sources were. Same thing in Iran. In Russia, if you have examples of that, feel free to put those at #APCompGov2020. We always look through a few multiple choice, and then we make our way into today's free response. So what is a common characteristic about civil liberties in both democratic and authoritarian regimes? And hopefully you know that is very common in both democratic and authoritarian regimes, that they both have written protections of civil liberties in the constitutions or laws. That's common to have written protections. How about which is the correct pairing of definitions? So if you have an authoritarian regime on the left and you have a democratic regime on the right, what is the most correct pairing? And that is also letter A, that authoritarian regimes do not consistently enforce written protections of civil liberties, particularly when the government's actions are criticized, whereas democratic regimes are more consistently enforce written protections of civil liberties. But what is a common method that both democratic and authoritarian regimes use to restrict civil liberties related to political participation? So if you have, can be a tricky one. How do democratic and authoritarian, with the similarity that they have, and that is that if there are acts of domestic terrorism, that both democracies and authoritarian governments come in and prohibit and punish activities related to speech, related to domestic terrorism. We certainly see that. How about illiberal democracy? So this is where we saw earlier a competitive authoritarian government is the way the course description described this, or also as a hybrid regime. An illiberal democracy is likely to use what method as a way to minimize protests that critique the government? And hopefully when you see illiberal democracy or hybrid regime or competitive authoritarian government, you think Russia. And Russia is a good example of, even though there's a guarantee of right to assembly, it's very common to use local security regulations to prevent the granting of permits, of local government permits for public protests. And here's that data set we saw from Freedom House. Which of these AP comparative countries would be least likely to use governmental coercion to suppress protests that critique governmental policies? So the use of coercion, the use of some degree of force or regulation, some degree of punishment. Again, coercion could be as slight as a traffic ticket, and it could be as severe as violence or death. So of the ones that are listed here, of the possible choices, Mexico, because of its protection of political rights and civil liberties compared to the other, Mexico is the least likely to use government coercion of those listed. So we're moving in argument essay. This is the last time in Unit 3 I'll be tackling an argument essay. I'll do more next week. And as we go through, I'm sure in test prep, you'll see others as well. I showed you this question earlier. Assess how a regime can be placed on an authoritarian or democratic scale based on the protection of civil liberties. Use the following course concept in your response, and it's civil society. And I'm hoping you feel confident to answer this. And again, go through that course description and maybe you can piece together what are some other ways you can turn these into argument essays. I am allowing you to use, or the way I've structured this question, typically you're restrained, but really you could answer this question, I think, with all 6 AP comparative government countries. So I'm going to choose to do China and Iran for my sample answer. But if you want to practice, I would highly recommend practicing with Russia or Mexico, Nigeria, or the United Kingdom. You could really answer this with any of the 6 AP countries. Now, before I start, well, I am going to start, I'm going to show you what not to do. Don't do this. Don't do this at all. I've mentioned before, this is a 7-point question, the argument essay. You get 1 point for the thesis, and you get 3 points for each of the evidence paragraphs if you provide reasoning. And if you connect those evidence to the claim and to that course concept, in this case, it's civil society. But if you don't have a thesis, even though it's only 1 point, it's a really critical point for this argument essay, because if you don't have a thesis, the maximum score you can get on this essay is only 2 out of the 7 points, which would be a disaster. So you gotta have a solid thesis. My really strong tip is to write 2-3 sentences, but more importantly than how many sentences you write, you really wanna be complete in your thought of making sure that your claim is connected to the prompt, and to make sure that you are providing a reason for your argument as a claim statement or as a thesis in order to get that point. I don't think this sentence does that. And so I wanted to show you this could be an easy way that a student thinks they're writing to the question, is trying to answer this question with an argument, but maybe is less complete and isn't focused on answering to the prompt, and all of a sudden doesn't get the thesis point, and all of a sudden they're looking at a maximum score of 2 out of 7 on the first FRQ. So don't do this. And I want you to point out why this wouldn't work. A regime is authoritarian if it does not protect civil liberties, because authoritarian regimes are more likely to have governments that punish civil society groups and criticize the government in assembly without government permission. So there's some typos in there. That's not why it doesn't get the point. It doesn't get the point because it doesn't respond to the prompt. Remember, the prompt is assess how a regime can be placed on an authoritarian and democratic scale. And this thesis is talking about authoritarian government. It's saying a government could be categorized as authoritarian because it doesn't protect civil society and civil liberties. It's certainly trying to make an attempt to answer the prompt. I don't know if this question actually gets to what the prompt is talking about with authoritarian and democratic scale. And so don't take a risk. Use the vocabulary of the prompt as part of your claim, your thesis, to make sure that you are writing and focused on what the prompt is answering you to do. AP stands for answer the prompt. Use the words of the prompt in your thesis. If you don't use the words of the prompt in your thesis, this could be deemed to really not be focused on what the prompt is asking you to do. Again, we're focused here on what that scale is, the democracy to authoritarianism. Think about it as that Freedom House scoring. So I don't know if this would get the point, and it could be disastrous. I wrote you a better example of a thesis. I tried to be more complete, a lot more complete, to make sure I get the point and to make sure that I speak to the prompt. So regime can be placed on an authoritarian democratic scale, just using the words of the prompt based on the protection of liberties by, I have to have a word of causation, because, due to, therefore, that is why, by the degree to which a government upholds the rights of civil society groups to assemble and criticize the government. Add a sentence, make sure you're complete. If a government consistently fails to uphold stated civil liberties protections, the country would be more likely to be placed toward the authoritarian side of a scale. We're talking about a scale, a spectrum, sometimes you can call it. So your thesis has to speak to that scale. So if you don't protect civil liberties, you're more likely to be on the authoritarian side of the scale, because that regime consistently punishes civil society groups that assemble without government permission and criticize the government. So trying to make sure my concept word is connected in there, making sure I have reasoning to explain, and really, really importantly, making sure my claim is responding to an argument that the prompt wants me to argue to. So I mentioned before, I use Iran and China as my evidence. So China's regime can be placed as authoritarian on a scale, on the authoritarian democratic scale. So China's authoritarian based on its lack of protection of civil liberties, because of the degree to which China's government does not uphold rights of civil society groups to assemble and criticize the government. So I'm taking my thesis and I'm now applying that to China, but I want to be really specific with my evidence, my country specific evidence. Since China's government consistently fails to uphold stated civil liberties protections, China would be placed more towards the authoritarian side on the scale. Repeat those vocabulary words from the prompt. Because China's regime consistently punishes civil society groups like independent religious groups, which are not allowed to operate in China, and any groups that criticize China's government and its ruling Communist Party. Okay, so criticism of the Communist Party is not tolerated. Independent religious groups are not tolerated. Those are specific to China. And so I use those as country-specific evidence to back up my claim, connecting, just make sure I have civil society in here. Yep, have it in here a couple different times. I have my reasoning, and I'm making sure that my claim is in there. So I'm hitting all 3 points for China. And then I turn to Iran. Iran's regime can also be placed as authoritarian on an authoritarian democratic scale, not being shy about repeating the vocabulary of the prompt based on not protecting citizens' stated civil liberties, because China's government regularly uses coercion to prevent civil society groups from assembling and criticizing the government. So very similar to China, with some country-specific examples. Since China's government routinely violates supposedly guaranteed civil liberty protections, Iran would be placed more towards the authoritarian side, because the regime punishes civil society groups that gather to criticize Iran's government and its ruling theocracy. So a country-specific example, theocracy in Iran, such as the Green Revolution protests against the 2009 election results. So a country-specific example of Iran violating civil liberties, cracking down on this protest, protests that were criticizing Iran's theocracy. So again, making sure my claim is in there, connected to the prompt, connected to that core concept, country-specific example, Iran, criticism of the theocracy. I think all 3 points there. So be complete, but make sure you're answering to that prompt, and make sure that claim is connected to the prompt, and make sure you put that concept in. So again, we're looking at civil liberties, political rights, civil rights, the use of coercion, particularly directed at that informal political participation, as we look at how governments treat civil liberties, specifically civil liberties. We try to connect, you should have seen connections here with democracy versus authoritarianism. Also connection with civil society, which connects with political culture. And inherently this connects also with upholding the rule of law, which we see independent judiciaries that we reference in Unit 2 are more likely to uphold that rule of law independently of what the executive wishes. So again, if you have examples of authoritarian governmental use of state-controlled broadcast media, feel free to put the examples out at hashtag APCompGov2020. Tomorrow, we are wrapping up Unit 3 with political and social cleavages, lots of different examples of political and social cleavages in our 6 core countries and how governments respond to those cleavages. If you have suggestions on a quantitative analysis, I'm trying to look for a good example of bringing some data in or an infographic. If you have examples, please feel free to share those at hashtag APCompGov2020. Thank you very much. We are wrapping up Unit 3 tomorrow. It's been a pleasure to have you join us in Studio Room 2C, where there's always room to see how countries compare. We'll see you tomorrow for 3.8 and 3.9. Be well.